And now we're recording. Okay. So this is the beginning of the nervous system. I kind of slide you through the muscles, because I believe that learning the muscles is something you learn in lab. I don't think I have much to add to it here in lecture. We kind of went over them the other day, but that's it. You can probably spend all but one of your labs the rest of the term learning the muscles. Because you only have about 1 day's worth of stuff to learn about the nervous system in this first chapter and a half. I'll lead you through that, and there's a few slides to look at. There's a couple of models to look at, but that's kind of it. So that's why we're just jumping on ahead in lecture. The nervous system fills up about a third of 232. We just barely start into the nervous system right here in 231. We do neurohistology. In other words, we look at the different cells that are involved in the nervous system under the microscope. And then we spend 1 day talking about the spinal cord. The spinal cord obviously connects the brain to the rest of the body. It has some very important principles that you need to learn, but it's a 1 day deal. And as I've handled several other chapters this way, it's one of those chapters that you better come to class or at least listen to it, because if I don't talk about it in class, it won't be on the test. The spinal cord chapter tends to be extremely extensive. I think it's a lot more than you need to know, but I think if you get the basic principles that I will go over with you, you'll have her down. Okay? All right, neural tissue. First of all, you need to know that the brain and the spinal cord are basically what's called the central nervous system. That's where about 95% of all of our brain cells live, our nervous cells live. And you need to know there are two types. There are neurons. Neurons are the cells that are nerve cells. They carry the shocks, they carry the little action potentials that trigger each other off. They're called neurons. They are all it is to making the neural system work. But then there's the other half of the cells that live in the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves that are called the neuroglia, or the glial cells. And the glial cells are just the guys that sit around and support the brain and nerve cells. Okay? All they do is take care of the neurons. Okay? There's about 5 or 6 types of glial cells that we'll go over today. You need to understand what they do, but just know that they don't actually do your thinking for you. The only ones that do the thinking for you are the neurons. Okay? The organs of the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, that's the main parts of it. There are also a few other things out there, like the sensory receptors in your different sense organs. Your eyes are big balls of nervous tissue that interpret light and allow you to see. Your ears have lots of special neural cells that help you interpret sound. Also, whether you're going up or down or whether you're twirling around, those things are coming from your ear area. And then there are nerves. Nerves don't live in the central nervous system. They don't live in the brain or spinal cord. They live out, and they basically connect everything with the nervous system. So the fact that you feel something, when I touch my finger, the reason I feel it is because there's a nerve that's connected to a sensory receptor here in my finger that carries that message all the way up to my spinal cord. My spinal cord then sends it to another nerve, which sends it all the way up to my brain. And then it goes to the part of my brain that I think with, called my cerebrum, we'll learn about. And basically, then I realize, oh man, something just touched my finger, But that's what nerves are. The anatomical divisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. These are pretty easy to remember. Just remember that the central nervous system is about 95% of it in terms of volume and weight. The central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. Everything that's away and outside of those two things is nervous system. So the central nervous system is the spine, brain, and spinal cord, like I mentioned. It contains a lot of things, not just nerve cells, obviously. It does contain the neural cells, the neural tissue, but also these connective tissues that we're going to talk about. A lot of blood vessels. It takes a lot of blood and a lot of oxygen to make your brain work and keep you conscious. And the functions of the central nervous system are basically the big computer in your head. They are, that's where all the cells live that process and coordinate all this information coming in, and they process all the information going out. So the sensory data, which is coming from your skin and from the outside of your body, is all connects up to your brain. And then the motor commands, the signals that you send saying, hey, I want to open my hand, then those also come from your brain up here and are sent out through motor nerves to make the muscles work to open your hand, for example. The higher functions of your brain, intelligence, memory, learning, and so forth, they are all up in the upper part of your brain, okay? The cerebrum. And just know that. And if I could give you a little talk, I'm going to break away from the book for a minute and talk about a baby. You all have babies? How many of y'all have had babies around the house? You know, babies are so amazing because they are born and they're so stupid when they're born. They really don't know anything. They know to eat, they know to suck, they have a few innate reflexes, but that's about it. And they have so much to learn, and they do that by repetition. So, for example, how many of you sat there and watched your baby do this? And try to put everything that they could possibly come up with into their mouth, right? You know why they put it all into their mouth? Because there's more sensory fibers in their mouth than anywhere else in your body and your lips and face right in here. So when they touch their face or when they bring things to their mouth, they get more stimulation to their brain than if they were scratching their back or something, okay? Because our face and our hands have the most sensation. But tell me if you remember the day this happened. Baby is kind of doing that, and then all of a sudden they go, and suddenly they realize that that hand, that thing they've been touching their face with all this time, is actually part of them. Think about it. So once they realize that's part of them, then they realize they can touch themselves all over. And they realize that when they do that, that's actually them, their fingers that are touching them. And what they're doing there is they're establishing patterns of these electric shocks in their brain. So every time they touch their face, it sends off that same set of electric shocks in their brain that says, hey, every time I see that set of electric shocks, or every time I feel that set of electric shocks, I know that's because I touched my face. Okay? There's another thing they're learning too. We have fibers in our joints and in our extremities that tell us where our joints are. Okay? In other words, I can put my hand back there right now and not even look at it, and I can tell you that I have 2 fingers held up, or I've got 4 fingers held up. Now, how do I know that? You ever thought about it? How do you know that you've got 4 fingers held up?
Your brain told it.
Your brain, but okay, your brain told your fingers to move like that, but then how do you know that it did it?
You feel it.
You feel it. I'm not touching anything. They're just sticking up. The point being, and this goes back to that baby thing, is we have these sensations in our extremities and in our fingers and so forth. They're called proprioceptive fibers. Proprioceptive fibers tell us where our joints are. So in our elbow, for example, we have sensory fibers in the joint and in the muscles and in the tendons and so forth that tell us whether our arm is out or whether it's bent, okay? Now, we didn't just learn that quickly. We had to do that 100,000 times to establish that set of patterns up in our brain that told us that, oh, my arm is bent. Oh, my arm is straight. Now, we watched it a few times. The baby watched it all the time. But the baby is continually putting that information together. And I think that's one of the hardest things for students to understand about the central nervous system is, you know, Dr. Sessions, you tell us about all these damn nerve cells and how they have, we study about all this action potentials and how they fire off and all these neurotransmitters and stuff, but how do you think? How do you think? And the way we think is by repetition. And think about it from the baby. That's how the baby learned that this is my fingers and this is my hand. This is actually part of my body. And eventually that baby gets to the point when that baby can do this. I hope I can do this. Close your eyes, stand up, look forward, and touch your nose. Wow, he did it. Now, how did I do that? Remember all those proprioceptive fibers that tell me where my elbow is, that tell me where my shoulder is, tell me what position my fingers are in, and all that stuff? Well, you know, it seems so simple to us now as adults, but think how many times we had to practice that before we figured it out. How many times did that baby, you know, put their hands all over their face before they kind of finally figured it out that, hey, it's not so cool to stick your finger in your eye, you know? But they did. They learned it eventually. Okay. Just remember, and the point that I make from that little spiel was the only thing that nerve cells do is they send sparks. They send little action potentials down from one nerve cell to another, to another, to another, to another. And our brain, by patterning and practicing and doing those things over and over and over again, we finally figure out that that's what thought is. Okay? And so higher level thought and memory and things like that are nothing more than sparks. But they're sparks that we've tried so many times and we fired off and we learned that pattern that now we realize that, oh, I understand those words that are coming out of that guy's mouth sitting up there on the front of the room because I've heard those words so many times. Otherwise, how would you guys understand anything I said, right? Maybe you don't anyway. But anyway. All right. It was kind of a digression, but so the brain is up there to incorporate and take all this sensory data, send out all this motor commands. Those are really pretty simple in the big spectrum of things compared to things like intelligence, memory, learning, and emotions. And what makes us sad? The only thing that makes us sad is patterns of sparks. Things we've done before that have made us sad in the past, or we think about thinking, oh, that should make us sad. It's all patterns. Peripheral nervous system is all the neural tissue that's outside of the CNS. Basically, its job is to simply bring the information in and to take the information back out to do whatever we need to do, whether that's move a muscle, whether that's to sweat, whether that's to open up or close down a blood vessel, or anything like that. Nerves, also called peripheral nerves, we'll learn a little bit about them. Nerves are nothing but a bunch of axons. In other words, they're just those long branches of the nerve cells. There's a whole bunch of them tied together, and we call that a nerve. They usually have some connective tissue and some blood vessels because they need blood supply just like everything else in our body does. We have a total of 43 nerves that come out of our brain, out of our central nervous system. We have 31 spinal nerves, 31 different vertebrae, 31 different spinal nerves coming out of it, and we have 12 cranial nerves. Now, there's nothing really magic about the cranial nerves, except for the fact that they come straight out of the brain. Okay? They don't come out of the spinal cord. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves come out of the spinal cord, and the cranial nerves come right out of the brain. So we're going to learn all 12 of those. You're going to learn about the cranial nerves and what each of them does. They're pretty important in healthcare and in our lives. But there you go. Another way to cut up the nervous system is between the afferent division and the efferent division. Afferent approaching. Okay, afferent division is sending all the information to the brain. So all that sensory information, that feeling, temperature, pain, all that stuff is in the afferent division. The efferent division is carrying all the signals out. They are exiting the brain. It goes out to all the muscles, the glands, and so forth. Hint, afferent approaches, efferent exits. For what that's worth. A couple other words you need to understand. One is called receptors. Receptors are just what they said. They are receptors. They receive the information. So we have touch fibers, touch receptors in our fingers, and they detect changes and they respond to stimuli. So when you touch your finger, it triggers that sensory nerve, and then that sensory nerve sends the message up to here. But that's the receptor out there. It's a combination usually of neurons and specialized cells. We're going to spend some time talking about it. Some of them are very complex. We're going to spend a whole chapter on the eyes and ears, learning how those very special receptors work. Effectors are the ones that cause the effect to happen. So we send messages out to our sweat glands, and our sweat glands carry out the effect of sweating, okay, to cool us down, for example, if need be. Those effectors can also be muscles, they can be glands, anything that our brain has an effect on are effectors. We also have another thing to split up. Another way to set things up in the efferent system, and then this is the messages that are going out to our body, and one of those is called the somatic nervous system. Whenever you hear the word somatic, think skeletal muscles, okay? Our somatic muscles. In other words, making our arms move, making things move that's under our control. Controls the skeletal muscle contractions, both voluntary and involuntary. Involuntary are just like your knee reflexes and things like that. The autonomic nervous system, I'm going to spend a minute talking about here. The autonomic system, you might think of as the automatic nervous system. Okay? What does that mean? What? You don't have to consciously think about it. That's right. And so if you don't have to consciously think about it, what part of your brain do you think runs your autonomic nervous system? Medulla. Let's just make it bigger than that. Let's just say the lower parts of your brain. Not the ones that do your real thinking, which is your cerebral cortex, the very top, your gray matter on top, but those lower parts of the brain that you probably don't know about much yet, but we're going to learn about. Okay? There are two parts to the autonomic nervous system, to the automatic nervous system. And I think they have very weird names, and I don't know why they named them this. But one is called the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division is basically that division of the automatic nervous system that stimulates you. Makes things go faster, bigger, better. And then the other division is the parasympathetic division. All right, I'm going to digress a little bit from the slides here again. Let's talk about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions for just a minute. Because I will come back to this 100 times over the next 2 months talking about these two divisions of the brain, because not only are these things important, but this is where almost all of the drugs that we use in medicine and pharmacy have their effect. Okay? All right. So, sympathetic division. Let's just say the sympathetic division is called the fight or flight division. And as you see here, it's the one that has the stimulating effect. Now, let's just think what would happen to each of us if a tiger walked in the room right now. Bye. You would flight. Okay? Anybody want to stay here and fight the tiger? The point is, that's where the fight or flight comes from. You've got to make a decision really quick whether you're going to fight or you're going to run from that tiger. But in either case, whichever of those you choose, what does your body need to do to get ready for that? Adrenaline, I heard that word. Yeah, okay, so it wants to get all juiced up and ready to go, and sure enough, adrenaline does play a big role in the sympathetic nervous system. What?
Heart rate.
Heart rate's going to go up.
Pupil dilation.
Pupils are going to get bigger. Whoa, there's a tiger there. You want to open your pupils so you can let in all the light you can so you can see that tiger as well as possible, because you're either going to be running from it or you're going to be fighting it. What?
Your blood gets drawn away from your unimportant system.
Okay, that's good. Where do you want to send the blood in your body? Your muscles, I heard. Your heart, right? Do you want to send it to your kidneys to make urine? Probably not.
That's your parasympathetic.
Yeah. Do you want to send it to your GI tract, to your stomach, to digest the food that you ate an hour ago for breakfast? No, you're just going to let that food sit there in your stomach, and you're not going to digest it, and you're not, because you can't afford to send the blood to those organs because they aren't really important in that situation when we've got a tiger in the room. Okay? How about the breathing tubes in your body? They're going to get bigger, right? They're going to open up so you can breathe more, so you can get more oxygen in. Okay? It goes farther than that, though. What we've been talking about are things you can actually see or feel and measure. It's also going to go as far as your insulin, your glucose. Your body is going to start freeing up all the sugar it can and raising your blood sugar level so that you've got more sugar, you've got more energy to fight or flight the tiger. Because this is life or death here, folks. Right? So it goes down to a molecular level. This sympathetic stuff goes all the way down. All your enzymes that make your muscles contract, all those things are going to get juiced up big time in a big hurry. Okay? Parasympathetic division. Let's let the tiger leave the room. Okay, the tiger has now left the room, and we're all feeling really good, and we're going to sit around, and it's going to be time to do the parasympathetic thing, the relaxing effect, which is referred to as rest and digest. Okay, so now we're going to sit around. We could probably even sleep if need be, because sleep will refresh us in many ways. We're going to now send blood to our intestines to digest that food that's sitting in there. We're going to send blood to our kidneys that's going to make us make urine, purify our blood. We can go quite a while without making any urine if we're stressed enough. Okay. It might even be time to think about having sex. Okay? Because sex is a parasympathetic thing. When the tiger walked in the room, was anybody thinking about sex? No. But it's part of life, right? And so sex is a factor carried out by the parasympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system. Okay? Basic structure, basic cells in the nervous system are called neurons. You're going to look at lots of them. This is kind of the basics. I think we've even showed you this picture earlier when we were talking about tissues. This is a standard neuron. This is what they look like. You'll never see one under the microscope that looks exactly like this, though. But just so you know, there are dendrites. There's lots of dendrites on most nerve cells. And they are the ones that are carrying the information in to this one cell here. The cell has a nucleus in it. It has a cell body. The cell body is basically the headquarters. It's going to be where the mitochondria are found. It's going to be where the other organelles are found. There's going to be cytoplasm in here. And then most cells are going to have one long axon, and that axon can be as much as 5 feet long. Okay? In other words, when I step on a nail, that message is sent all the way to my brain through 1 or 2 neurons. So each neuron, each axon can be that long. Okay? Don't ever forget about that. And if I stepped on that nail, it wouldn't be just one little nerve cell that got stimulated down there. It would probably be 1,000 of them that had little sensations. And those 1,000 axons would all be bound together as a nerve from that one area, okay, before they got to the spinal cord. And then they would go up through the spinal cord as a group as well. So basically, dendrites are afferent axons or efferent. The message comes in this way, the message goes out that way. At the end of the axon are these little splits, we call them telodendria, which is where we're going to study and learn about how these axons interact with the next thing along the line. Now, the next thing along the line could be a muscle, in which it's telling this muscle to contract. It could be another nerve that's going to send the message farther down. It could be a gland. Closer up, dendritic branches, Nissl bodies. We call them Nissl bodies because Dr. Nissl found them. But basically all they are is RER and free ribosomes. Mitochondria are in here. Golgi apparatus is in here. Neurofilaments are in here. Nucleolus. What do nucleoli do? Huh? They have DNA? I don't know. Never can keep that straight. I'll probably better learn it, though. Or know about nucleolus. Okay, so then we have this area of the nerve cell right here. We call it the axon hillock. And basically the axon hillock is that area of the nerve cell which makes the decision as to whether or not we're going to fire off an action potential. So all this information comes in here, like this. It kind of gets processed in the cell, and the cell makes a decision as to whether it wants to send a message on up to the brain or wherever it's going. Okay? This first part is called the initial segment of the axon. The reason we mention these is because we're going to be talking about those, because this is where the creation of that spark, the creation of that action potential happens. Okay? And, we put a lot of information together in order to make these decisions as to whether or not to send along this next message. How many of you, I've probably asked this question before, but how many of you have been sitting here listening to the fan in the projector? You have? Really?
A little bit.
A little bit. Most of you have been filtering that out, right? Because you think, that's just that silly fan. It's not really bothering me that much. So what the cells of your brain are doing is they're taking that information that's coming in from your ears and from vibrations or whatever. It's coming in here, and your brain, your nerve cell is saying, you know what, this is very important. I'm not going to send it on down the road. Fair enough? But sometimes we do. And I can tell you the other day when that guy in the next room over there was, you guys were taking a test and he was doing the callback thing. Pretty darn irritating, wasn't it? Those messages were getting passed right on up to your brain pretty well. You need to know about synapses. We have a couple of physio-X's that have to deal with this that we'll be mentioning. I wouldn't start on them for another day yet, but the synapse is where one neuron communicates with another cell. Now notice it says another cell. It doesn't say another neuron. Although a lot of times that's what it's communicating with, is one neuron is passing the message to another neuron to another neuron. And indeed, all those patterns that we were talking about in the brain as to where your hand is and so forth, those are all neuron to neuron synapses going around and around. Sometimes hundreds of thousands of synapses are taking place. But it could also be a muscle cell, it could also be a sweat gland, any kind of gland that the nerve is attaching to at the synapse. Yes?
I was just wondering how it's different than the teledendria.
The teledendria is part of the synapse. Going back to that. Yeah, this is like the first part of the synapse, and then there's going to be something else right here, which is the second half of the synapse, the connection, what it connects to. Okay, so neurons, as I've said before, that's the ones that do everything for us in terms of our functions of our nervous system. And then remember, the neuroglia are the ones that take care of the nerve cells, protect them, keep the chemicals all right, and they're very essential to the survival of the neurons. I would also throw this in and tell you that almost nobody gets a brain tumor of their neurons. Our nerve cells almost never turn into cancers. Almost all brain tumors are glial cells. Astroglia, astrocytomas, almost all of the brain tumors that you hear about are tumors of these different neuroglial cells that kind of got out of control. That's what cancer is. It's when cells get out of control and take over. Okay? But we almost never get them of the nerve cells. All right, neuroglia are about half the volume of the nervous system. And this one picture right here is almost everything you need to know about the neuroglia. Okay? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 types of neuroglial cells, and I'm going to go through them right here. Okay? Yeah, it's in your book. There you go. First of all, this slide is divided into 2 parts. The peripheral nervous system over here, which is stuff outside of the brain and the spinal cord, right? We only have two different types out in our nerves and so forth. One is called a satellite cell. Satellite cells surround neuron cells out in ganglia. Satellite cells are important because they help control the oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, neurotransmitter levels. Neurotransmitters are those chemicals that go from the teledendria to the other, across the synapse to the other cell, and so forth. Satellite cells are only found in the periphery. Schwann cells are the ones that wrap around axons out in the peripheral nervous system. They are responsible for the myelination. What's myelin?
The sheath around the
Right. It's like the insulation around the wires. Okay? Remember, neuron cells are kind of like wires that carry shocks, carry electricity, but if you have them insulated around the outside, it carries it a lot better and a lot faster. Okay, so that's what Schwann cells do. Schwann cells also play an important role in repairing nerves. In other words, you can crush the nerve at this point here, and you make the neuron, the axon, which runs through that little hole right there, the axon may be killed. The nerve cell may be killed. But if the Schwann cell doesn't get killed, there's still that hole, that tube that the axon can regrow right back through, and that's why nerves do regenerate. Okay, because the Schwann cells maintain a pathway for them to regenerate and grow back. We'll talk about nerve repair in a minute. The central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, of course, has 4 different types of neuroglial cells. And really easy, the first one is called ependymal cells. Ependymal cells line the inner side of the brain and the inner canal of the spinal cord. They monitor, they circulate cerebral spinal fluid. Remember that your brain sits in a water bath that protects it from being shaken too badly. It protects it from all kinds of things. But the fluid that it sits in, called cerebrospinal fluid, is it's pretty much like water. It does have some chemicals in it, which we will talk about a little bit. Also in the central nervous system are these cells called oligodendrocytes. Now, oligodendrocytes are kind of there to hold up the nerve cells, keep them in position, and they also myelinate the cells. So our brain cells inside of our brain are also myelinated. They're insulated. The problem with them is they really interfere with our brain recovering because they don't line up just perfect, and they die pretty easily. And so that when you have a brain injury, for example, these traumatic brain injuries that we were seeing from the wars, when those happen, the oligodendrocytes get destroyed, and there is no tubes for the brain cells to regrow, to reestablish the same patterns. So basically, a guy who is injured has to relearn things. He just completely has to start over and has to reestablish those patterns, just like that baby did, establishing those patterns like this. Okay? So walking, thinking, so forth become very difficult, basically due to oligodendrocytes. Astrocytes, I mentioned astrocytomas. I think that's the most common cause of brain cancers. Astrocytomas and astrocytes maintain the blood-brain barrier. What's the blood-brain barrier? Boy, this is a tough one. I should ask an essay question on this every term. What is the blood-brain barrier? Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't it keep a lot of things out of your brain, like a lot of drugs and stuff?
That's right.
Depending on what it is, some things break the barrier.
Right. The astrocytes really control what gets into your brain cells and what doesn't. For example, if you have diabetes, your blood sugar goes up after you eat usually and so forth. Well, it goes up everywhere else in your body except in your brain because your brain is protected by these astrocytes. So your normal blood sugar is 100. If you are diabetic and your blood sugar out here in the periphery when they draw your blood is 350, it's still 100 inside of your brain. The reason for that is the blood-brain barrier. Because the blood-brain barrier protects your brain from all the abnormalities in your blood. Okay? If you think about how important that is, think about how long we would last when the tiger walked in the room if we were a little woozy or a little bit unconscious or something like that, because our brain wasn't working just right. And you realize that this is the most important organ in our body to keep us alive. Because if we don't have a brain that's working good, we can't either fight or flight. We can't walk or run and get away. We're kind of dead meat. So astrocytes are very important in that. That's what their job is. They recycle neurotransmitters. They form a lot of scar tissue after injury. This is another problem, is when that scar tissue forms inside the brain, then the brain cells can't grow back through it and reestablish the connections like we'd like them to. Microglia are the little cell. They're smaller than the others. They are they clean up the cell debris, waste products, eat up bacteria. They work by phagocytosis. They're basically macrophages. They eat up stuff. Microglia. And then ependymal cells already mentioned. Okay? So we will continue to refer back to these different 6 kinds of neuroglia as we go farther, but let's just leave it at that right now. I'm now just going to go through them one by one. I think I've said all of this, so I'm going to just... you can always see the ependymal cells really easily because they line the central canal of the spinal cord. Here's a slice through the spinal cord right here. There is a little canal that goes all the way down through the spinal cord, which is called the central canal. It's filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and it's lined by ependymal cells. Astrocytes, I've said these things, so I won't say them again. This is another good point. Myelination. Myelination is that white insulation material that appears on the outside of nerves. That's what makes white matter white. You've probably heard of gray matter and white matter. We'll talk about it a lot as we go through the brain. Gray matter is gray because it has a lot of the cell bodies. The nuclei, the nucleoli, the Nissl bodies, all that stuff. The nucleus of the nerves. The white matter is mostly just a whole bunch of axons going in the same direction, and most of the time they're myelinated. And myelin is white. Okay? So when we talk about the gray matter and the white matter, that's the difference between white matter and gray matter. White matter is mostly myelinated axons. Gray matter is mostly cell bodies. Okay? Nodes and internodes. I think you guys have been exposed to these nodes of Ranvier. The axons, as they go for foot after foot, every so often there's a break in the myelin between. What cells make that myelin? Schwann cells, very good. Somebody's still awake. That's good. Yeah, so these are the gaps between the internodes where the axons. We'll talk about nodes later some more. All right, so this is the point I've already made about myelination and oligodendrocytes. White matter is where there's many myelinated nerves. Gray matter is where there's lots of unmyelinated areas. Mostly it's areas that have cell bodies. It's the cell bodies that make them dark. And then microglia are the cleaner uppers that we talked about. This is a cartoonist's view of this stuff, of these cells. If this is the central canal up here, you notice that it's completely lined with ependymal cells. And then out in here, the blue ones here are the nerve cells, okay? And those are the neurons. And then these yellow things are all little dendrites that are connecting in on these things. And then among these things, there are microglial cells, as illustrated here. I think this is an oligodendrocyte that makes myelin here, and on and on. What is a ganglia? A ganglia is nothing but a collection of nerve cell bodies surrounded by a neuroglia. They're found in the peripheral nervous system. We have some little ganglia out in our body, which are collections of nerve cells. For example, we have a ganglia on our heart. A nerve comes down and stimulates the ganglia. The ganglia then stimulates other nerves to make the heart beat faster or slower, things like that.
Last two, these are in the peripheral nervous system. Nice view here. Node of Ranvier here, node of Ranvier there, between different satellite Schwann cells, rather. Notice that this one Schwann cell may surround a whole bunch of different axons, it's not one for one. All right, I'm going to stop right here, and we'll take our quiz right now.
How's that for fun? Going out to everybody.